What if the oldest story humanity ever told was not about gods? What if, long before the Anunnaki descended into the myths of Mesopotamia, before kings ruled cities, before the first temple rose from the mud of the Euphrates, something else walked the earth? Not gods, not humans, something older, something the ancient scribes described with a phrase so strange that it survived for thousands of years on fragile clay tablets. They breathed differently. Tonight, we travel into that forgotten world. But before we begin, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel across the world. Now dim the lights, settle into your chair, and let your imagination drift backward through time. Far beyond recorded history, far beyond the first civilizations, far beyond the age of the Anunnaki, into a world that may have vanished hundreds of thousands of years ago. The story begins not with humanity, not even with the gods. It begins with silence. Imagine Earth 300,000 years before the arrival of the beings later remembered as the Anunnaki. The continents were familiar, yet utterly different. The rivers flowed through landscapes untouched by cities. No roads crossed the plains. No towers pierced the horizon. No writing existed. No kingdoms. No empires. No memory. Only the endless rhythms of nature. The wind moved through forests that stretched for thousands of miles. Storms rolled across empty valleys. Ancient oceans breathed against untouched shores. And somewhere within that vast and silent world, according to the oldest traditions of Mesopotamia, another order of beings existed. The Sumerians never described this era as empty. That is perhaps the most surprising detail. Most creation stories begin with chaos, darkness, nothingness. But certain fragments preserved in ancient texts hint at something different. They speak of a time before humanity and before the familiar gods. A time occupied by entities whose nature was fundamentally unlike anything that came later. The ancient scribes struggled to describe them, not because the beings were invisible, not because they were unknowable, but because they belonged to a reality governed by different rules. The world itself operated differently then. The boundaries between life and matter were uncertain. The distinction between a creature and a landscape was often blurred. Water could think. Mountains could remember. The sea possessed intention. The sky itself was alive. To modern minds, this sounds symbolic. Yet for the people who recorded these traditions, it was not symbolism. It was history. The oldest Mesopotamian cosmologies speak of primordial rulers who existed before the younger gods established order. These entities were not administrators of cities. They did not issue laws. They did not build temples. Instead, they embodied forces so ancient that later generations struggled to classify them. One of these primordial beings was associated with the freshwater abyss beneath the earth. Another with the vast salt oceans that surrounded the known world. Together, they represented powers older than creation itself. But even they were not necessarily the beginning. Behind them lingered shadows, hints of an even earlier layer of existence, fragments so old that the names have almost vanished. This is where the mystery deepens, because throughout human history, civilizations repeatedly preserved stories about forgotten rulers who came before the gods. The Greeks remembered titans. The Egyptians spoke of primordial beings dwelling within the waters of noon. The Hurrians preserved tales of ancient powers overthrown by younger generations. The Vedic traditions described conflicts between older rulers and new divine orders. Again and again, across thousands of years, across thousands of miles, the pattern remained remarkably consistent. Someone came before. Someone ruled before. Someone was replaced. And someone was forgotten. Or perhaps intentionally erased. Imagine standing on a shoreline in that unimaginable age. The air feels different. The stars overhead are familiar, yet somehow more distant. There are no human voices, no fires burning in villages, no songs, no prayers. Only the sound of water moving through darkness. Then imagine seeing shapes emerge from the horizon. Not animals, not humans. Something else. Ancient traditions describe some of these beings as connected to water in ways that seem almost biological. They did not merely live near rivers and oceans. They emerged from them. The deep waters were not their territory. They were their origin. Many later myths preserved memories of teachers, sages, and rulers who rose from the sea carrying knowledge. Knowledge of writing, knowledge of mathematics, knowledge of astronomy, knowledge that would one day shape civilization itself. But where had those teachers learned such things? The oldest traditions offered a remarkable answer. They inherited it. They inherited it from beings who existed before the known gods, before the first cities, before the beginning of history, before memory itself. And perhaps that is why the ancient scribes preserved such unusual descriptions. They were trying to explain creatures that belonged to a forgotten chapter of existence. Creatures remembered only through fragments. Creatures whose names had already faded by the time the first tablets were written. Creatures who, according to some traditions, ruled the earth for ages so vast that even the gods who followed them seemed young by comparison. As the centuries passed, their stories grew fainter. Their faces changed. Their identities blurred. Yet traces remained. In myths, in symbols, in strange archaeological discoveries. In the oldest questions humanity still asks. Who came before us? What existed before civilization? And why do so many ancient cultures insist that the world once belonged to someone else? Tonight we have only opened the first door. Beyond it lies a forgotten age filled with primordial rulers, vanished kingdoms, and the first great struggle for control of reality itself. And at the center of that forgotten world stand two mysterious names that would echo through thousands of years of myth. Lamu and Lahamu. Lamu and Lahamu. Today those names are known only to specialists who spent their lives translating damaged clay tablets and studying forgotten fragments of Mesopotamian mythology. Yet thousands of years ago, they stood at the threshold of creation itself. To understand who they were, we must travel even deeper into the oldest layers of human memory. Further back than kings, further back than the Anunnaki. Back to a time when the universe itself was still young. The ancient Babylonian text, known as the Enuma Elish, preserves one of humanity's oldest surviving descriptions of creation. The story begins in a world without continents, without stars, without gods as we know them. There's only water. Not ordinary water, living water, conscious water. Two immense primordial beings existed within the endless darkness, Apsu and Tiamat. Apsu represented the freshwater abyss hidden beneath reality itself. Tiamat represented the vast salt oceans that surrounded existence. To modern readers, these names are often interpreted as symbols, but to the ancient scribes who wrote these stories, they were far more than symbols. They were living entities. They possessed voices. They possessed wills. They possessed power. And from their union emerged the first generation of beings, the first rulers, the first inheritors of existence, Lamu and Lahamu. Their names are strange even by ancient standards. Scholars still debate their exact meanings. Some interpretations connect them to Mut or silt. Others suggest ideas related to hair, growth, or emergence. Yet regardless of translation, their importance within the mythological structure is undeniable. They arrived before the younger gods, before the celestial rulers, before the beings later known as the Anunnaki. The texts describe them not as creators, not as warriors, not as kings, but as primordial presences, ancient powers standing between chaos and order. In some traditions, they appear almost as living boundaries between worlds, guardians of a reality still taking shape. What makes them particularly fascinating is how different they appear from the gods that followed. The younger gods often behave like people. They argue, compete, build cities, create laws, demand worship. Lamu and Lahamu seem almost alien by comparison. The oldest descriptions rarely focus on their actions. Instead, they emphasize their existence itself, as though simply being was their defining characteristic. Imagine standing on Earth during their age. There are no cities, no temples, no priests, no civilizations, only endless landscapes stretching toward the horizon. The sky glows with unfamiliar constellations. The oceans seem larger, the atmosphere heavier. And somewhere beyond ordinary perception, these primordial rulers shape reality simply through their presence. They do not need armies. They do not require monuments. The world responds naturally to what they are. Many ancient traditions preserved a curious memory about this earliest age. The rulers of the first world did not govern through laws. They governed through being. Reality itself aligned around them. Nothing needed to be commanded. Nothing needed to be enforced. Order existed because they existed. This idea appears repeatedly throughout ancient mythology, a forgotten era in which existence functioned differently. An era before language became the primary tool of power. Before names, before categories, before civilization divided reality into thousands of separate pieces. The first rulers belonged to a more unified world, a world modern humans can barely imagine. And yet, traces of their memory survived, not only in Mesopotamia, across the ancient world. The Egyptians described primordial beings who emerged from the waters of Nun long before the familiar gods appeared. The Greeks remembered titans who ruled before Olympus. The Hurrians preserved stories of ancient powers buried beneath mountains. The Vedic traditions spoke of earlier rulers whose authority was later taken away. Again and again, the same pattern emerges. The first rulers were older, stronger, more mysterious, and fundamentally different. But if Lahmu and Lahamu ruled the first age, a question immediately appears. What happened to them? Why are they almost forgotten? Why do later myths focus on younger gods instead? The answer lies in one of the oldest and most important themes in mythology: the overthrow of an older order. Across countless cultures, history begins with a conflict between generations. Older powers lose control. New rulers emerge. The previous age collapses. A new age begins. Mesopotamian mythology preserves exactly such a transition. The descendants of Lahmu and Lahamu multiplied. New generations appeared. Younger beings emerged. Each generation grew more ambitious, more active, more interested in shaping the world according to their own vision. Eventually, the ancient balance could not survive. The younger powers sought control. The primordial order began to fracture. The first age was ending, and something unprecedented was approaching. A war unlike any later conflict. A struggle not between kingdoms, not between nations, but between entire versions of reality. The old rulers represented one way of existence. The younger gods represented another. And according to the oldest traditions, only one could survive. As the first tensions spread through creation, the ancient waters themselves began to stir. The descendants of Lahmu and Lahamu chose sides. The younger gods gathered strength. And deep within the darkness of the primordial ocean, Tiamat awakened. For countless ages she had watched, silent, ancient, patient. Now she would become the center of the greatest conflict in pre-human history, a conflict that would reshape the world forever, a conflict that would ultimately open the path for the rise of the Anunnaki themselves, and with it, the destruction of the first world. Long before humanity built its first city, before kings wore crowns, before priests recorded sacred histories onto clay tablets, the universe itself was said to have witnessed a war. Not a war between nations, not a war between armies, a war between ages, a war between realities. The ancient Mesopotamians believed that the world they inhabited was not the first version of existence. It was the result of a victory, a replacement, a successful rebellion carried out by younger powers against rulers who had governed before them. And at the center of that conflict stood Tiamat. For countless ages, Tiamat had existed as one of the great primordial powers. She was not merely associated with the sea. She was the sea, the living embodiment of the endless salt waters that surrounded creation. To later generations, she became something monstrous, a dragon, a chaos beast, a terrifying enemy of civilization. But the oldest layers of the story suggest something more complex. Tiamat was not originally evil. She belonged to an older order, an older reality, a reality that was slowly disappearing. As younger generations of gods emerged, creation became increasingly crowded. The new gods were active, energetic, ambitious. Unlike the primordial rulers, they sought change. They desired movement, expansion, creation. Their activity filled the cosmos with noise. The ancient texts repeatedly emphasize sound. The younger gods disturbed the silence. They transformed a stable universe into something unpredictable. And according to the myths, this disturbance eventually triggered the first great crisis. The primordial powers grew angry, not because they were cruel, but because they represented a different way of existence. Imagine an ancient forest standing unchanged for millions of years. Now imagine a new species arriving and reshaping everything. Neither side is necessarily evil, but coexistence becomes impossible. That is how the ancient storytellers understood the conflict. The old world and the new world could not occupy the same space forever. Eventually, a decision had to be made. The younger gods chose revolution. The older powers chose resistance. The stage was set. The ancient texts describe terrifying preparations. Tiamat began creating allies, not ordinary allies. Monstrous beings unlike anything later generations would recognize. Gigantic serpents, horned creatures, scorpion beings, hybrid entities that combined features of animals, humans, and forces of nature. Some scholars interpret these descriptions symbolically. Others view them as mythological expressions of cosmic forces. Regardless of interpretation, one detail remains consistent. The armies of Tiamat were fundamentally different from the younger gods. They belonged to the old order, to the age before civilization, to the age before the Anunnaki. As tensions escalated, the younger gods searched desperately for a champion, someone powerful enough to challenge the primordial rulers, someone willing to risk everything. Eventually, they found him, Marduk. In later Mesopotamian religion, Marduk would become one of the greatest gods in the entire pantheon. But during this ancient conflict, he was still a rising power, young, ambitious, determined. The gods offered him supreme authority if he could defeat Tiamat. He accepted, and with that decision, the fate of the first world was sealed. The descriptions of the battle are among the most dramatic passages in ancient literature. Storm winds filled the heavens, the oceans rose, reality itself trembled. Marduk advanced against Tiamat, carrying weapons forged specifically for this confrontation. The younger gods understood something important. The old rulers could not be defeated through ordinary means. They represented foundational aspects of existence itself. To overthrow them required transforming reality. According to the myth, Marduk unleashed enormous winds that trapped Tiamat. Unable to close her mouth, unable to control the storm surrounding her, she became vulnerable. Then came the fatal strike. The younger god attacked, the primordial ruler fell, and with her fall, the first age ended. But the story becomes even stranger afterward. Because Marduk did not simply destroy Tiamat, he used her body to create the world. The heavens were formed from one part, the earth from another. The structure of reality itself emerged from the remains of the defeated primordial order. Think about what that means. The new world was literally built from the old one. Nothing vanished completely. The previous age survived within the foundations of the next. Its rulers disappeared, its authority ended, but its substance remained. This idea appears repeatedly throughout ancient traditions. The new world always rests upon the bones of the old world. The victors inherit what they overthrow. And so it was with the younger gods. They celebrated their triumph. They established a new hierarchy, a new order, a new cosmos. For the first time, reality became structured according to rules that later civilizations would recognize. Names were assigned, functions were distributed, power was organized. The age of primordial rulers was over. The age of divine administration had begun. Yet something curious happened. The ancient scribes never completely forgot those earlier beings. Despite Marduk's victory, despite the rise of younger gods, despite thousands of years of religious development, the memory of the first rulers refused to disappear. Fragments survived, scattered references, half-erased names, mysterious descriptions preserved in rituals and myths, almost as if the old world continued whispering beneath the surface of the new one. And perhaps that is exactly what the ancient storytellers believed, because according to some traditions, the first rulers were never truly destroyed. They were displaced. Their authority was taken. Their age ended, but they remained somewhere beyond ordinary sight, waiting, remembering, watching. And while the younger gods celebrated their victory, another mystery quietly emerged. If the primordial rulers had governed reality before the Anunnaki, who possessed the sacred knowledge that controlled existence itself, who held the powers later known as the Me? And how did those powers pass from the first rulers into the hands of the gods who followed? The answer lies within one of the strangest concepts in all of ancient Mesopotamian mythology. After the fall of the primordial rulers, the universe entered a new age. The younger gods established order. The great cosmic conflict faded into memory. Reality became structured, predictable, governed. Yet beneath the surface of this new world, echoes of the first age remained. The ancient Mesopotamians believed that power itself existed in a form that could be possessed, transferred, protected, even stolen. They called these forces the me. To modern ears, the word sounds simple, but the concept was extraordinary. The me were not laws, they were not ideas, they were not symbols. They were the fundamental powers that made reality function. Everything possessed a me. Kingship had a me. Wisdom had a me. Writing had a me. Music, justice, craftsmanship, leadership, even civilization itself. Each existed because its corresponding me existed. Without them, the world would lose its structure. The most fascinating detail is that the younger gods did not create these powers. The oldest texts consistently describe them as inheriting, guarding, distributing, or recovering them. The me already existed, long before human history, long before cities, perhaps even before the Anunnaki themselves. This detail raises an unsettling question. If the me were older than the younger gods, who possessed them first? The ancient stories never provide a direct answer, but they leave clues. Imagine a vast treasury hidden beneath reality, not filled with gold, not filled with jewels, but with the blueprints of existence itself. Every force, every principle, every pattern that would eventually shape civilization. Now imagine those treasures existing before the rise of the younger gods. Someone had to guard them. Someone had to understand them. Someone had to wield them. And according to the oldest layers of mythology, that responsibility may have belonged to the rulers of the first world. This possibility transforms the entire narrative. The primordial beings were no longer simply ancient rulers. They become something far stranger, custodians of reality itself, guardians of forces later civilizations barely understood. Perhaps that is why so many traditions remembered them with a mixture of fear and fascination. Not because they were monsters, but because they represented a level of knowledge that later ages could no longer access. Imagine standing in that forgotten era. There are no libraries, no schools, no written language. Yet knowledge exists everywhere. It flows through the fabric of existence itself. The stars move according to patterns already understood. The rivers follow hidden laws. The seasons unfold with mathematical precision. The first rulers do not need to study these systems. They are part of them. The knowledge exists naturally, like breathing, like sight, like memory. When later civilizations emerged, they inherited only fragments, pieces, remnants, echoes. The complete picture had vanished. Many ancient myths preserve a remarkable theme. The greatest treasures are never gold or weapons. They are always knowledge, forbidden knowledge, lost knowledge, knowledge stolen from earlier ages. Again and again, heroes journey into hidden realms, seeking wisdom left behind by older beings. Again and again, the pattern repeats. Someone once knew more. Someone once understood reality more completely. Someone once possessed powers that later generations could barely imagine. The Mesopotamians expressed this idea through stories about the me. The Greeks preserved it through myths about Titans and Prometheus. The Egyptians remembered it through divine records hidden within sacred chambers. The pattern remains surprisingly consistent. Civilization did not begin with discovery. It began with inheritance. Humanity inherited fragments of something older, something already ancient before history started. And nowhere does this idea become more intriguing than in the legends surrounding the first teachers of mankind. Because according to Mesopotamian tradition, civilization did not emerge spontaneously. Humanity did not simply wake up one morning and invent writing, or mathematics, or astronomy. The oldest traditions describe mysterious beings who brought knowledge from elsewhere, teachers who emerged from hidden places, teachers who carried wisdom from an age long forgotten. Some were described as sages, others as divine messengers. Still others appeared as strange hybrid figures associated with water. All shared one characteristic. They knew things ordinary humans did not. They understood the structure of reality. They possessed knowledge inherited from earlier ages. The Mesopotamians called these figures the Apkallu, the legendary sages, the bringers of civilization. And according to some traditions, their connection to the first rulers was far deeper than later generations realized. The Apkallu were often described as emerging from the deep waters, not from mountains, not from heavens, not from distant stars, from water, from the same primordial depths associated with the earliest powers of creation. The same depths connected to Apsu, the same depths from which the first rulers had emerged. It is a detail easy to overlook, yet it appears repeatedly throughout Mesopotamian mythology. Knowledge comes from below. Wisdom rises from hidden waters. The deepest truths originate in places older than the gods themselves. Perhaps the ancient storytellers were preserving a memory that the wisdom of civilization did not begin with the Anunnaki, a memory that the first teachers inherited their knowledge from an even older source, a source reaching back into the forgotten age before recorded history. And if that is true, then the destruction of the first rulers was never complete, because their greatest possession survived. Not their kingdoms, not their authority, not their names, their knowledge. It flowed quietly from one age into another, hidden within myths, protected within sacred traditions, waiting for future generations to rediscover it. But there is another mystery, a mystery buried not in ancient texts, but in the earth itself. Because thousands of years before the first Sumerian city rose from the plains of Mesopotamia, strange figures were already being created. Figures with elongated heads, unusual eyes, bodies unlike anything familiar. Artifacts so mysterious that archaeologists still debate their meaning today. And some researchers have wondered whether they preserve humanity's oldest visual memory of the rulers who came before the Anunnaki, long before the first kings ruled Mesopotamia, before the earliest temples reflected sunlight across the plains of southern Iraq. Another culture flourished in the same region. It left behind no written records, no royal inscriptions, no legendary epics, only fragments, silent traces buried beneath thousands of years of history. And among those traces were figures unlike anything that came later. Small clay figurines, carefully crafted, strange, unsettling, mysterious. Today, archaeologists call this civilization the Ubaid culture. It existed thousands of years before the rise of Sumer, thousands of years before the Anunnaki appeared in written mythology. And it left behind one of the most puzzling collections of artifacts in the ancient world. Imagine entering a museum gallery. Inside a glass display case stands a small figure no taller than your hand. At first glance, it appears human, but the longer you look, the stranger it becomes. The head is elongated. The eyes are almond-shaped. The face seems almost reptilian. The proportions are unusual. The expression impossible to interpret. Now imagine not one such figure, not 10, but hundreds, discovered across multiple settlements, created over generations, repeated with remarkable consistency. The same strange features, the same unfamiliar appearance, the same sense that these figures represented something important. The question has fascinated researchers for decades. Who exactly were these beings? Ancestors, spirits, gods, mythological creatures, or symbols of something entirely forgotten? No one knows for certain. The people who made them left no explanation. Their voices vanished thousands of years ago. Yet the images remained, waiting, silent witnesses from a world older than history. What makes the mystery especially intriguing is their timing. These figures appear before the rise of urban civilization, before writing, before the great temples of Sumer, before the detailed mythologies that later generations recorded on clay tablets. In other words, they belong to a period remarkably close to the era many ancient traditions associated with forgotten primordial rulers. Of course, archaeologists approach such connections cautiously. There is no evidence that the Ubaid people believed they were depicting ancient rulers. There is no inscription identifying the figures, no surviving explanation. But myths often preserve memories far older than the civilizations that record them. That possibility has fascinated historians for generations, because throughout human history, visual memory often survives longer than written memory. A story can change, a name can disappear, but an image may endure for thousands of years. Imagine a child living in an Ubaid village 7,000 years ago. The sun is setting. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Adults gather near the edge of the settlement. Someone carries a clay figure resembling the strange forms preserved in museums today. The child asks a simple question. Who is that? The answer is spoken. A story is told. A memory passes from one generation to another. Thousands of years later, the words are gone. Only the figure remains. The image survives. The explanation vanishes. This process has happened countless times throughout human history. Sometimes artifacts outlive the stories that gave them meaning. And when that happens, mystery is born. The Ubaid figures are not the only example. Across the ancient world, archaeologists have discovered images that seem to depict beings unlike ordinary humans. Elongated heads, large eyes, unusual proportions, hybrid forms combining human and non-human characteristics. These images appear in different cultures separated by vast distances. Most likely they arose independently. Yet they reveal something fascinating about the human imagination. Again and again, people remembered earlier beings as different, not merely older, different, fundamentally separate from ordinary humanity. The same pattern appears in mythology: the Titans of Greece, the primordial beings of Egypt, the ancient rulers of Mesopotamia, the first powers of Vedic tradition. All possess characteristics that distinguish them from later generations. They belong to another category of existence. And perhaps that is why the Ubaid figures continue to attract attention. They seem to embody that same feeling, that same sense of encountering something older, something unfamiliar, something standing at the edge of memory. Yet there is another reason these artifacts matter. They remind us how little we truly know about the distant past. Modern civilization often imagines history as a straight line, simple, predictable. Primitive people becoming advanced people, ancient villages becoming cities, cities becoming civilizations. But the archaeological record rarely tells such a simple story. Again and again, discoveries reveal forgotten complexities, lost traditions, unexpected sophistication, entire worlds erased by time. The Ubaid culture itself is a perfect example. For thousands of years, its settlements flourished, its people farmed, traded, built communities, created art, developed technologies. And then, gradually, another transformation began. A new age approached. The age of cities. The age of temples. The age of organized religion. The age that would eventually produce the Sumerians. As civilization expanded, older traditions faded. Ancient symbols disappeared. New gods rose to prominence. New stories replaced older memories. The focus shifted toward the younger divine generations, toward the gods who governed cities and kingship, toward the Anunnaki. Yet beneath these newer narratives, traces of the older world persisted, like roots hidden beneath a forest floor, invisible but still present. Perhaps that is why ancient Mesopotamian texts occasionally hint at rulers who existed before the familiar gods. The memories never vanished completely. They survived in fragments, in myths, in symbols, in mysterious artifacts, and perhaps most importantly, in stories about knowledge itself. Because the greatest inheritance from the First Age may not have been physical, not temples, not monuments, not artifacts, but wisdom. Ancient knowledge carried forward through generations. Knowledge preserved by figures known as the Apkallu, the legendary sages who emerged from the waters and taught humanity the foundations of civilization. And according to some of the oldest traditions, the wisdom they carried may have originated in a world far older than Sumer itself. The Apkallu arrived from the water. That simple statement appears again and again throughout the oldest Mesopotamian traditions. Not from mountains, not from distant kingdoms, not from the heavens, from the deep, from the hidden waters beneath the world. To the people of ancient Mesopotamia, this detail mattered. Water was never merely water. The rivers that nourished civilization were sacred. The seas beyond the horizon were mysterious. And beneath everything lay the great freshwater abyss known as the Apsu, a realm older than cities, older than kings, older than the Anunnaki themselves. It was from this primordial depth that the Apkallu emerged, the sages, the teachers, the bringers of civilization. According to tradition, humanity did not create its earliest knowledge alone. The foundations of culture arrived through these mysterious figures: writing, agriculture, architecture, mathematics, astronomy, law, the skills that transformed scattered settlements into civilization. All were said to have been taught by the Apkallu. Imagine the first villages appearing along the fertile riverbanks of Mesopotamia. Small communities surrounded by endless wilderness. Families struggling against floods, droughts, disease, and uncertainty. Then imagine wise strangers arriving. Figures possessing knowledge no ordinary person could explain. They understand the movements of stars. They know when rivers will flood. They teach methods for building stronger homes. They explain patterns hidden within nature. To the people receiving such knowledge, these teachers would have seemed almost supernatural. And perhaps that is why the stories surrounding them became so extraordinary. Many ancient depictions portray the Apkallu as hybrid beings, part human, part fish, or clothed in fish-like garments. At first glance, the imagery appears strange, but within Mesopotamian symbolism, it carried profound meaning. The fish represented origin, connection, memory. The Apkallu emerged from the same waters associated with the earliest age of existence. The same waters connected to Apsu, the same waters that belonged to the primordial rulers before the rise of the younger gods. And this raises an intriguing possibility. What if the Apkallu were not simply teachers? What if they were heirs? What if they carried forward fragments of knowledge inherited from the forgotten world that existed before the Anunnaki? The ancient texts never say this directly, yet the connections are difficult to ignore. The first rulers came from the waters. The primordial powers emerged from the waters. The ancient wisdom originated from the waters. The Apkallu emerged from the waters. Again and again, the same source appears, as though the deepest knowledge of civilization flowed from a reservoir far older than recorded history. Imagine the world after the fall of the primordial age. The younger gods have established order. The old rulers have vanished. Their authority is gone. Their kingdoms are forgotten. But their knowledge remains. Somewhere in the depths, hidden, protected, waiting. Then, over time, fragments begin to surface. A teaching here, a revelation there, a new understanding passed to humanity. The knowledge survives, even if the rulers themselves do not. Many cultures preserve remarkably similar traditions. The Egyptians spoke of divine teachers who emerged from primordial waters. The Greeks remembered culture heroes who brought knowledge to mankind. The Vedic traditions described ancient sages who preserved wisdom from earlier ages. Different names, different stories, yet the pattern remains surprisingly consistent. Civilization is inherited, not invented, passed down. not created from nothing. This idea may explain why so many ancient peoples viewed knowledge as sacred. To them, wisdom was not merely information. It was a relic, a treasure surviving from a more complete age, something fragile, something precious, something worth preserving. The Mesopotamians expressed this belief through stories of hidden tablets and sacred powers. The Egyptians preserved secret teachings within temple complexes. The Greeks imagined lost ages of wisdom that preceded their own. Again and again, humanity looked backward, toward an earlier world, toward forgotten teachers, toward lost knowledge. But if the Apkallu carried fragments of primordial wisdom, another question naturally follows. What exactly happened to the original source? Where did the first rulers go? Were they destroyed during the Great Cosmic Conflict? Did they vanish entirely? Or did they retreat somewhere beyond ordinary perception? The ancient traditions provide a fascinating answer. Not all stories describe destruction. Many describe withdrawal, retreat, displacement. The primordial powers do not always die. Instead, they move into hidden realms, beneath the earth, beyond the horizon, into sacred waters, into mysterious domains existing alongside the ordinary world. This concept appears across countless mythologies. The old rulers never completely disappear. They remain present, but inaccessible, sleeping beneath mountains, dwelling beneath oceans, waiting in forgotten realms, watching the rise and fall of civilizations. The Mesopotamian imagination was no different. The deep waters remained. The Apsu remained. The hidden places endured. And within those hidden places, memory survived. Perhaps that is why the oldest stories often carry an unusual sense of melancholy. They are not merely tales of victory. They are stories of loss of an earlier world, loss of forgotten knowledge, loss of beings who understood reality differently. The younger gods inherited power. Humanity inherited civilization. Yet something was left behind, something ancient, something difficult to define. As centuries passed, the memory faded, the names became obscure, the stories fragmented. The original rulers drifted further into legend. Yet echoes remained, echoes found not only in myths, but in civilizations separated by thousands of miles. Because when we look beyond Mesopotamia, toward Egypt, Greece, India, and the ancient Near East, a remarkable pattern begins to emerge. Different cultures, different languages, different histories, yet all remembering strangely similar stories. Stories about forgotten rulers, about displaced powers, about an age that existed before the gods themselves. And once those parallels are placed side by side, the mystery becomes far deeper than anyone might expect. If the story ended in Mesopotamia, it would already be fascinating. Ancient rulers, forgotten ages, wisdom carried across thousands of years. But the mystery becomes far more remarkable when we leave the river valleys of Sumer and begin traveling across the ancient world. Because once we compare distant civilizations, something unexpected appears. The same story, again and again and again. Different names, different landscapes, different gods. Yet beneath the surface, the structure remains astonishingly familiar. An older race rules the world. A younger generation rises. A great conflict occurs. The ancient rulers are defeated. Their knowledge survives. Their memory fades. Their traces remain hidden beneath history. Consider ancient Greece. Most people know the Olympian gods: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena. They dominate classical mythology. Yet before the Olympians came another generation, the Titans. Ancient powers who ruled the cosmos long before Zeus seized control. Kronos, king of the Titans, governed during a legendary age remembered as vastly different from the present. An earlier word, a forgotten order. Eventually, the younger gods rebelled. War followed. The Titans were defeated. The Olympians inherited the universe. Sound familiar? The pattern closely resembles the Mesopotamian transition from primordial rulers to younger divine generations. Yet Greece was separated from Sumer by immense distances and centuries of cultural change. Still, the memory endured. Now travel south, toward Egypt, the land of pyramids, the land of the Nile, the land whose civilization survived for more than 3,000 years. Ancient Egyptian priests preserved their own account of the earliest age, before the familiar gods, before Osiris, before Horus, before Isis. There existed the primordial waters of Nun, an endless expanse that preceded creation itself. Within those waters dwelt ancient powers unlike the gods who followed. Some traditions describe them as the Octoad, 8 primordial beings representing forces older than the created world. They were not ordinary gods. They belonged to an earlier reality, a reality that disappeared when creation began. Once again, the pattern appears. Ancient rulers, primordial waters, replacement by younger powers. The same structure survives under different names. Now continue east, beyond Mesopotamia, beyond Persia, into ancient India. There we encounter one of humanity's oldest religious traditions, the Vedic world. At first glance, the stories seem entirely different. Different language, different geography, different culture. Yet, hidden beneath the surface lies another familiar narrative: the Asuras. In later Hindu tradition, many Asuras became associated with forces opposing the gods. But the earliest texts paint a more complicated picture. Originally, the Asuras possessed tremendous authority, knowledge, power, creative abilities. They belonged to an older order. Only later were they displaced by the Devas, the younger divine powers who came to dominate the cosmos. Once more, the same pattern. An earlier generation replaced by a later one. An older authority losing power. Ancient wisdom passing into new hands. It is difficult not to notice. Civilization after civilization preserves versions of the same memory. Why? No one knows. Some scholars argue that cultures influenced one another through trade and migration. Others point to universal psychological patterns.
Perhaps every civilization naturally imagines a lost golden age. Perhaps humans instinctively create stories about earlier rulers. It is certainly possible. Yet there remains something strangely persistent about the details. The primordial rulers are rarely portrayed as simple villains. They are often described as wiser, older, closer to the origins of existence. Even when they are defeated, they retain an aura of mystery, as though later generations secretly recognize their importance. Imagine humanity as a child growing up. The child eventually surpasses its parents, builds its own life, creates its own identity. Yet part of its foundation always comes from those who came before. Perhaps ancient myths express a similar idea. The younger gods inherit a world they did not create. They inherit knowledge, power, structures, responsibilities. Even victory cannot erase that inheritance. The old world remains beneath the new one. Its influence continues, its memory survives.
This idea becomes particularly interesting when we examine one recurring symbol shared across many traditions: water. Again and again, the oldest rulers are connected to water. The primordial ocean, the abyss, the deep, the hidden sea. Mesopotamia had Apsu and Tiamat. Egypt had Nun. India associated ancient powers with cosmic waters. Even Greek mythology begins with primordial entities connected to oceanic forces. Why water? Perhaps because water represents origins. All life emerges from it. Every civilization depends upon it. Rivers create cities. Seas connect worlds. Rain sustains existence. Water is both creator and destroyer. Ancient people understood this deeply. To them, the deepest waters represented more than nature. They represented beginnings, the place where all things originate. And so the oldest rulers naturally emerged from those depths, not because they were fish, not because they were aquatic creatures, but because they belonged to the beginning itself, to the source,
To the hidden place from which reality first unfolded. The more we compare these traditions, the more one idea becomes impossible to ignore. Humanity has always remembered something older, something that existed before the familiar order, something that stood at the edge of memory. Perhaps the details changed over time. Perhaps myths transformed and adapted. Perhaps names were forgotten. Yet the underlying memory persisted. A forgotten age. A lost world. Ancient rulers. Displaced powers. Hidden knowledge. The story survived because each generation inherited fragments from the one before, like pieces of a shattered mirror scattered across continents. No civilization possessed the complete picture. Each preserved only a fragment, a reflection, a memory. And perhaps that is why the mystery remains so compelling today, because the fragments never completely fit together. They point toward something larger, something just beyond reach, something humanity has been trying to remember for thousands of years. But the most surprising clues may not come from mythology at all. They may come from science, from discoveries hidden within our own biology, from evidence suggesting that human history may be far more complicated than anyone once imagined. Because deep within the human genome, researchers have discovered traces of ancient populations that should not exist. Populations with no known names, no known history, and no known graves. Only genetic echoes, lingering from a world long vanished. For most of human history, myths and science occupied separate worlds. One dealt with stories, the other dealt with evidence. One preserved memory, the other pursued proof. Yet every so often, a discovery emerges that blurs the boundary between them. Not because it confirms ancient legends, but because it reminds us how incomplete our understanding of the past truly is. One such discovery arrived through genetics. The study of DNA has transformed our view of human history. For centuries, people imagined human evolution as a relatively simple process. One species replacing another. A straightforward progression from ancient ancestors to modern humanity. Reality turned out to be far more complicated. As scientists began decoding ancient genomes, they uncovered a hidden world. A world populated by multiple human relatives living side by side. Neanderthals, Denisovans, other archaic groups. Entire populations that once shared the earth with our ancestors. Even more surprising, these populations did not remain isolated. They interacted, they migrated, they interbred. The modern human genome still carries traces of those ancient encounters. Tiny fragments of DNA inherited from relatives long extinct. The discovery changed everything. Suddenly, human history became crowded, complex, layered. Ancient humanity resembled a tapestry woven from many different threads. But the surprises did not end there. Researchers soon noticed something even stranger. Certain genetic signatures appeared to originate from populations that remain unidentified. Populations for which no confirmed fossils have been discovered. No complete skeletons. No known names. Only genetic traces, like footprints without a traveler. Evidence that someone had been there, yet no clear indication of who they were. Scientists refer to these mysterious contributors as ghost populations. The name sounds almost mythical, but it describes a very real scientific problem. Genetic evidence suggests that unknown groups once existed and contributed to the ancestry of later populations. Yet their identities remain hidden. Imagine finding a letter written by someone whose existence has been completely forgotten. No photograph, no grave, no historical record, only the letter. That is essentially what geneticists encounter when studying ghost populations. The evidence exists. The authors remain invisible. Of course, these discoveries do not prove ancient myths. Science and mythology operate according to different principles. Yet they reveal something fascinating. The distant past contained more diversity than previous generations imagined. Entire populations existed and vanished. Their stories disappeared. Their names were forgotten. Yet traces survived. Fragments hidden within the people who came after them. The idea feels strangely familiar. Ancient traditions often described forgotten rulers who vanished while leaving behind hidden inheritances, knowledge, power, memory, influence.
The biological discoveries of modern science tell a different story. Yet the underlying theme remains surprisingly similar. The past is never completely gone. It survives in unexpected ways. Imagine standing beside a fire 10,000 years ago. Around you sit people whose descendants will eventually spread across continents. Some carry ancestry from groups already disappearing. Others inherit traits passed down from populations no longer remembered. None of them know it. None of them understand the immense future unfolding before them. Yet their bodies already contain pieces of forgotten worlds, fragments traveling silently through time, generation after generation, century after century, millennium after millennium, until they reach us. The concept becomes even more intriguing when we consider another mystery. Across the world, archaeologists have discovered ancient human remains displaying unusual physical characteristics: elongated skulls, uncommon proportions, features that have inspired speculation for decades. In many cases, scientists have identified cultural explanations. Artificial cranial deformation, for example, was practiced by numerous societies. Infants' heads were carefully shaped during development, creating elongated appearances. The practice was widespread and well documented, yet the fascination persists because these discoveries tap into something deeper. They remind us that human history contains countless lost traditions, practices, beliefs, worldviews, entire systems of meaning that vanished before written records could preserve them. When modern people encounter these remains, they often project myths onto them. Ancient rulers, forgotten races, hidden civilizations. Most such interpretations remain speculative, yet they reveal a powerful truth about human imagination. We are drawn toward mystery, especially mysteries involving origins. Who came before us? What have we forgotten? How much of history has disappeared? These questions have haunted humanity since the beginning of civilization. The ancient Mesopotamians asked them. The Egyptians asked them. The Greeks asked them. We continue asking them today. Perhaps that is why stories about primordial rulers endure. They transform abstract uncertainty into narrative. They give shape to the unknown. They provide language for mysteries that resist easy answers. And there is certainly no shortage of mysteries. Consider Göbekli Tepe, a site in modern Turkey that predates Stonehenge by thousands of years. Massive stone pillars, sophisticated construction, complex symbolism, created by people living long before the emergence of cities. Even today, archaeologists continue debating its purpose. Or consider the countless settlements buried beneath modern landscapes. Entire communities erased by floods, earthquakes, changing climates, and time itself. History preserves only a fraction of what once existed. The deeper we look into the past, the more uncertainty we encounter. And within that uncertainty, ancient myths find fertile ground. Not because myths provide scientific answers, but because they preserve questions. Questions remembered across generations. Questions powerful enough to survive thousands of years. Who ruled before us? What knowledge was lost? What disappeared before history began? The answers remain elusive. Yet one thing becomes increasingly clear. Humanity has never completely forgotten the idea of an earlier world. Whether through myths, archaeology, or genetics, traces continue to surface, small clues scattered across time. Fragments of a puzzle no civilization has fully assembled. And perhaps the most intriguing fragment of all concerns a place that appears repeatedly throughout ancient traditions. A hidden realm, a forgotten domain, a place where the displaced rulers of the First Age were said to have gone after their power was taken away. A place beneath the world, beyond ordinary sight. A place remembered in Mesopotamia by a single mysterious name. Kher. Kher. The name appears throughout ancient Mesopotamian mythology like a shadow moving beneath the surface of a dream. Sometimes it is described as a mountain, sometimes as the underworld, sometimes as a distant realm beyond ordinary reality. The descriptions vary, the details change. Yet one theme remains remarkably consistent. Kher is a place of separation, a place where ancient powers dwell beyond the reach of the living world. To modern readers, it may sound like a simple underworld, but for the Mesopotamians, the concept was far more complex. Kher was not merely where the dead went. It represented a boundary, a threshold between worlds, a hidden domain existing alongside reality itself. And according to certain traditions, some of the oldest beings in existence retreated there after losing their authority. Imagine standing at the edge of civilization 5,000 years ago. Night has fallen. The stars shine above the desert. Beyond the glow of the settlement stretches a darkness filled with mystery. The people of Mesopotamia looked into that darkness and imagined hidden realms, places inaccessible to ordinary humans, places where forgotten powers still lingered. Kher became one of those places, a repository of ancient memory, a sanctuary for displaced forces, a reminder that the visible world was not the only world. This idea appears across countless cultures. The Greeks imagined Tartarus. The Norse remembered deep realms beneath Yggdrasil. The Celts spoke of hidden worlds beyond the horizon. Again and again, ancient peoples described locations where older beings continued to exist after their age had ended. Not destroyed, not erased, removed, separated, as though history itself possessed hidden chambers where forgotten powers could endure. The Mesopotamian imagination placed many of those powers within Kher. It was there that ancient entities vanished, there that old forces withdrew, there that memories of earlier ages survived beyond the reach of ordinary time. What makes this concept fascinating is its emotional quality. Ancient stories rarely describe these realms with pure fear. There is fear, certainly, but also sadness, nostalgia, a sense of something precious being lost. The first rulers may have been defeated, yet the myths often imply that something valuable disappeared with them. Knowledge, connection, wisdom, an understanding of reality that later ages struggled to recover. Imagine a great library sinking beneath the ocean. Its books survive, its knowledge survives, but access becomes impossible. Future generations know the library once existed. They know treasures remain inside. Yet they cannot reach them. That image captures much of the emotional atmosphere surrounding Ker. The realm becomes a symbol of lost access, a place where ancient truths remain hidden beyond human reach. Many myths describe heroes attempting journeys into such realms. Some seek wisdom, others seek immortality, others simply seek answers. The journeys rarely end easily, because hidden knowledge always carries a price. Mesopotamia preserved one of the most famous examples through the Epic of Gilgamesh. Although Gilgamesh's story belongs to a later age, it reflects the same underlying theme: humanity searching for knowledge that once seemed accessible. Humanity pursuing secrets hidden within forgotten domains. Humanity trying to recover something lost. The search never truly ends. Perhaps that is why stories about primordial rulers remain so powerful. They represented the ultimate lost inheritance, the oldest knowledge, the first wisdom, the original connection to the foundations of reality. Whether those rulers existed literally was almost beside the point. The stories endured because they expressed a universal human feeling, the sense that something important lies just beyond memory, just beyond reach, just beyond understanding. And surprisingly, modern archaeology sometimes creates similar feelings. Every year, researchers uncover forgotten cities, buried temples, lost settlements, entire cultures previously unknown. History continually expands. The deeper we dig, the larger the past becomes. Consider how many civilizations have vanished completely. Countless languages disappeared without leaving written records. Entire peoples left behind only fragments, broken pottery, weathered foundations, scattered tools. The overwhelming majority of human history has been lost. The surviving record resembles a few surviving pages torn from an immense book. Most chapters are missing. Most stories are gone. Ancient myths understood this intuitively. They transformed that absence into narrative, into hidden realms, into forgotten rulers, into places like Kur. As the centuries passed, the memory of the first world continued fading. The younger gods dominated religion. Cities expanded. Empires rose and fell. The Anunnaki became central figures within Mesopotamian cosmology. Yet beneath every new layer of history, older layers remained, like foundations beneath a city, invisible but essential. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson preserved by these ancient traditions. Nothing truly disappears. Worlds end, civilizations collapse, names are forgotten. Yet traces endure. In stories, in symbols, in landscapes, in memory. The first rulers vanished from power, but not from imagination. Their age ended, but their presence lingered. The myths kept them alive, generation after generation, millennium after millennium, waiting for listeners willing to travel backward through time and ask the oldest question of all: what came before. And now, as we approach the final stage of our journey, all the scattered fragments begin to converge. The primordial rulers, the great cosmic conflict, the hidden knowledge, the Apkallu, the mysterious artifacts, the forgotten realms, the genetic echoes, the recurring myths. Each fragment points toward a single possibility: that humanity has spent thousands of years preserving the memory of a world older than the gods themselves, a memory that refuses to die, a memory whose final secret still remains to be uncovered. As our journey nears its end, the pieces begin to settle into place. Not perfectly, not completely. The ancient past rarely offers certainty. Instead, it offers fragments, echoes, whispers carried across unimaginable spans of time. Tonight, we have followed those whispers backward, beyond recorded history, beyond the rise of cities, beyond the Anunnaki, into a forgotten landscape populated by primordial rulers, hidden knowledge, and memories that refuse to disappear. What, then, are we left with? Perhaps not answers, but something equally valuable: perspective. The ancient Mesopotamians believed the world had not always been the way they knew it. Before their gods stood older powers. Before order came chaos. Before civilization came mystery. The same belief appeared in Egypt, in Greece, in India. Across countless cultures separated by vast distances and thousands of years, each civilization remembered a first world, an earlier age, a forgotten order. Whether these stories reflected shared memories, universal human imagination, or something else entirely, remains impossible to know. Yet their persistence is remarkable. Humanity continually returned to the same idea. Someone came before. Someone ruled before. Someone knew more than we do now. Modern archaeology tells a different story, but one that contains its own mysteries. Ancient settlements continue to emerge from beneath deserts and forests. New discoveries repeatedly force historians to revise accepted narratives. Civilization grows older every decade. The deeper we investigate the past, the more complex it becomes. Modern genetics tells a similar story. The human family tree is not simple. It is tangled, layered, filled with forgotten branches and vanished populations. Even our own bodies preserve traces of worlds long gone. History survives within us, not as myths, not as legends, but as inheritance. And perhaps that is where mythology and science unexpectedly meet. Both remind us that the past is larger than we imagine, much larger. Entire chapters have disappeared, entire civilizations vanished, entire peoples left behind little more than shadows. Yet something always survives: a story, a symbol, a fragment of DNA, a ruined foundation beneath a modern city, a name written on a damaged clay tablet. The past never completely releases its hold. That may explain why the legends of primordial rulers continue to fascinate us. The rulers themselves are almost secondary. What truly captures our imagination is the possibility they represent. The possibility that history extends deeper than memory, The possibility that forgotten worlds once existed beyond the horizon of recorded time. The possibility that humanity inherited far more than it remembers. Imagine standing once more on that ancient shoreline from the beginning of our story. The sky is dark. The ocean stretches endlessly before you. No cities exist. No temples. No monuments. Only silence. The same silence that existed before history. The same silence that surrounded the first myths. The same silence that inspired ancient people to ask questions whose answers still elude us. Who came before us? What existed before civilization? What memories have been lost? The waves move across the shore, one after another, endlessly, just as generations have done for thousands of years. Each generation inherits fragments from the one before. A story, a belief, a mystery. Then passes those fragments onward. No one possesses the entire picture. No one ever has. The Mesopotamian scribes preserved one fragment. The Egyptians preserved another. The Greeks another. The archaeologists of today uncover still more. Each fragment illuminates part of the puzzle, yet the complete image remains hidden. Perhaps it always will. And maybe that is exactly why these stories endure, because mysteries are not meant to be solved completely. Some mysteries exist to remind us of the limits of our knowledge, to keep us curious, to encourage us to keep searching. The primordial rulers may never be identified. The first world may never be reconstructed. The forgotten age before the Anunnaki may remain forever beyond the reach of certainty. Yet its memory survives, not as fact, not as proof, but as one of humanity's oldest and most persistent questions. A question whispered through myths, temples, ruins, and ancient texts. A question that has traveled thousands of years to reach us tonight. What stood at the beginning? Long before the first king, long before the first city, long before the first written word, long before the Anunnaki. The ancient storytellers believed the answer lay hidden beneath layers of time, buried within the foundations of reality itself. And perhaps, in a way, they were right, because every discovery reveals another mystery. Every answer uncovers another question. The horizon keeps moving. The unknown remains. The search continues. And somewhere beyond the edge of memory, beyond history, beyond myth, the first world still waits in silence.